August 2014, the North Shore of Kauai. Rain falls softly on volcanic soil that has grown sugarcane, taro, pineapple, and now holds silence. Beyond the town of Kilauea, past beaches where tourists photograph waterfalls and humpback whales breach in winter waters, a narrow road curves through fields of green. The air tastes of salt and wet earth. Iron gates appear where none stood before. Security cameras track the approach. Beyond them, a compound spreads across land that remembers plantation labor and Hawaiian sovereignty, and the sound of wind through forest that once covered these hills. More than 2,300 acres. 2 mansions totaling 57,000 square feet, 30 bedrooms, 30 bathrooms, an underground shelter spanning 5,000 square feet, protected by blast-resistant doors filled with concrete, an 18-foot water tank, conference rooms, industrial kitchens, soundproof doors operated by keypad, 11 treehouses connected by rope bridges, perched in the canopy like something from a childhood dream, a network of tunnels beneath the surface, linking structures that cost more than $100 million to build. Beautiful. Yes. The compound sits between the Pacific Ocean and Emerald Mountains draped in clouds, designed to blend with Kauai's natural landscape. Cattle graze on pastures. Organic ginger grows in carefully tended rows. Macadamia trees drop their harvest. The stated mission speaks of conservation, agriculture, protecting endangered species, preserving the island's rural character. But this estate was assembled through shell companies that disguised the buyer's identity. Legal maneuvering forced native Hawaiian families into court battles over ancestral land. Strict non-disclosure agreements silence everyone who works there. Construction crews, ranch hands, security guards, maintenance staff. Workers who post on social media that they're employed at the ranch have been fired. A 6-foot wall blocks ocean views from the public road. Cameras watch. The gates remain closed. Behind the agricultural mission and conservation rhetoric lie 8 lawsuits filed against hundreds of Hawaiians who held rights to small parcels of land their ancestors received in 1850. A security guard's fatal heart attack on a muddy trail during heavy rain, his family offered $7,500 for burial expenses. A pattern of acquisitions that transformed a quiet corner of paradise into something closer to a fortress built by one of the world's wealthiest men, designed for privacy so complete that even the dead beneath the soil are fenced off and monitored. Can a man buy privacy in a place where land carries ancestral memory? Can technology's most public figure construct a completely private world? What happens when private wealth rivals the operating budget of an entire island? When one family's compound costs more than a county spends in a year on roads, schools, and public safety combined? If you're drawn to stories about wealth, land, and the price others pay for one family's retreat, consider subscribing. Your support makes these investigations possible. Let's begin. August 2014. The North Shore of Kauai holds rain like a secret. Facebook's founder was 30 years old and worth approximately $30 billion when he first walked onto 700 acres of land between the ocean and the mountains. The man was Mark Zuckerberg. The story of how he built this compound would ignite controversy that continues to this day. Mark Zuckerberg was 30 years old in 2014. He had created Facebook in a Harvard dorm room a decade earlier, launching the site in February 2004 with 4 roommates whose names would become footnotes to his fortune. By August 2014, Facebook claimed 1.35 billion users worldwide. The company's market value exceeded $200 billion. Zuckerberg himself was worth approximately $30 billion, making him one of the youngest billionaires in history. He had taken the company public in May 2012, retaining majority control through a dual-class share structure that gave him voting power far beyond his equity stake. The initial public offering raised $16 billion, the largest technology IPO ever completed at that time. By 2014, Facebook had become infrastructure, not a website but a utility, woven into daily life across continents, languages, time zones. Zuckerberg lived in Palo Alto, California, where he had purchased multiple homes on the same street to create a buffer zone around his primary residence. He owned property in San Francisco, a compound on Lake Tahoe. His real estate portfolio would eventually exceed $320 million in value. He was married to Priscilla Chan, a pediatrician he had met at a fraternity party during his sophomore year at Harvard. They had begun dating in 2003, married in 2012, and by 2014 were planning for children. But wealth brought scrutiny. Cameras followed him to restaurants. Strangers approached him at coffee shops. Security became a permanent feature of his life, a cost of building platforms that made privacy obsolete for billions while eroding his own. The contradiction was not lost on observers. The man who encouraged users to share their lives, their locations, their relationships, their political views, now sought refuge from the very transparency his company had monetized. Facebook's mission statement spoke of connecting people, building community, bringing the world closer together. Zuckerberg's personal mission appeared to be the opposite: distance, separation, walls. The technology that eliminated boundaries for users would fund a compound designed to create them. By 2014, he was already thinking about islands. Not metaphorical islands. Actual land surrounded by ocean, where gates and security protocols could enforce the privacy that California suburbs could not provide. Hawaii appeared frequently in those conversations. Remote, beautiful, far from Silicon Valley but still American soil, still accessible by private jet, still governed by laws he understood. Kauai, the oldest of Hawaii's main islands, offered something the others did not: vast stretches of undeveloped coastline on the North Shore, land that remained agricultural, communities small enough that newcomers were noticed, but wealth common enough that billionaires were not unprecedented. He had built an empire connecting billions. Now he wanted a place where no one could find him. In August 2014, 2 adjacent parcels of land came up for sale on Kauai's northeast coast. Combined, they totaled roughly 700 acres stretching from the Pacific Ocean inland toward the island's volcanic spine. The properties had separate histories. One was 350 acres that included the land above Pila'a Beach, a remote stretch of sand accessible only by foot trail or through private property. The asking price was $49.6 million. The other was the Kahu'aina Plantation, 350 acres of former sugar land where immigrants from Portugal, Japan, the Philippines, and China had worked the fields for generations. That parcel cost $66 million. The seller on the Pila'a property had hired a broker. The broker received inquiries from several parties, but the ultimate buyer arrived through channels designed to obscure identity. A limited liability company with a Hawaiian-sounding name made the offer. Another LLC, similarly opaque, purchased the plantation land. The transactions closed within weeks of each other. Public records showed the LLCs. The person controlling them remained hidden. Local residents welcomed the sale initially. Better a private buyer committed to conservation than a developer planning luxury subdivisions. The previous owner of one parcel had discussed building multiple homes. The new owner promised the land would remain largely undeveloped, dedicated to agriculture and preservation. That promise arrived through attorneys. The attorneys would not name their client. The truth emerged gradually. First came the wall. A traditional lava rock structure, 6 feet high, appeared along Koʻolau Road where none had stood before. The wall blocked views of the ocean. It interrupted the trade winds that had cooled homes on the Mauka side of the road for decades. Neighbors complained. The wall remained. Then came the cameras, mounted on poles, surveying the perimeter. Then the security guards, stationed at the gates where the private road met the public highway. By late 2014, the name had leaked. Mark Zuckerberg owned the land. The Facebook founder had paid roughly $100 million for 700 acres of Kauai's North Shore. The properties would be combined into a single estate called Koʻolau Ranch. Agricultural operations would continue. Cattle, organic ginger, a nursery, the land would be preserved. The existing uses would remain, with one addition: a private compound for Zuckerberg and his family, a retreat from the scrutiny that followed him in California. The community's reaction split along predictable lines. Some saw opportunity, employment, investment, philanthropy. A wealthy owner who might support local causes, fund improvements, become a responsible steward. Others saw colonialism in new form, tech money displacing local families, walls and cameras transforming open land into fortress, a pattern older than Hawaii's statehood, older than the plantations, a story written again and again since Captain Cook arrived in 1778. Outsiders claiming paradise, altering it, making it private. The debate was beginning when the first bulldozers arrived. Construction crews came from Honolulu, from the mainland, from wherever labor could be found for projects that required discretion. Every worker signed non-disclosure agreements. Every contractor agreed to confidentiality clauses. The compound would rise behind walls and legal protections built by people forbidden to speak about what they were building. The wall went up within months. Cameras followed. Then came the lawsuits. December 30th, 2016. 8 lawsuits were filed in Kauai County Court. The plaintiffs were limited liability companies controlled by Mark Zuckerberg. The defendants numbered in the hundreds. Native Hawaiians who might own small parcels of land scattered throughout the 700-acre estate. Most of the defendants had never set foot on the property. Many did not know they owned anything at all. The land in question totaled approximately 8 acres divided among 14 parcels. These were kuleana lands, a category unique to Hawaii, rooted in history that predated American statehood by more than a century. In 1848, King Kamehameha III initiated the Great Mahele, a land division that ended the traditional system of communal land use and introduced private property ownership. 2 years later, the Kuleana Act of 1850 allowed native Hawaiian tenant farmers to claim title to small plots they had been cultivating. The goal was to provide indigenous people with a stake in the new system. The result was that less than 1% of Hawaii's land area was granted to native Hawaiians. Kuleana lands passed automatically to heirs, generation after generation, often without formal documentation. A farmer who received 2 acres in 1850 might have descendants numbering in the hundreds by 2016. Each descendant owned a fractional interest, sometimes less than 1%, in land they might never have seen. Property tax bills went unpaid because no single heir felt responsible. Titles became clouded, ownership unclear, family trees tangled across continents and centuries. This was the situation Zuckerberg's attorneys confronted when surveying the 700 acres purchased in 2014. Embedded within the larger estate were 14 kuleana parcels. Who owned them? The question had no simple answer. One parcel traced back to a Portuguese immigrant named Manuel Raposo, who had worked on a sugar plantation and purchased 4 parcels totaling 2 acres in 1894. By 2016, Raposo's descendants numbered approximately 300 people. Most lived off-island. Some had never heard the family name. A few, like Carlos Andrade, a 72-year-old retired professor of Hawaiian studies, had lived on the land and paid taxes on it for more than 40 years. The lawsuits sought to resolve ownership through a legal process called quiet title. The mechanism was straightforward. When multiple people hold fractional interests in a property and ownership cannot be clearly established, a court can order the land sold at public auction. The proceeds are divided among the identified owners. The buyer, typically the person who filed the lawsuit, obtains clear title. The original owners lose the land but receive compensation. Zuckerberg's attorneys framed the action as necessary and fair. The land could not be properly managed with ownership scattered among hundreds of unknown heirs. The quiet title process would identify everyone with a claim and ensure they received payment for their share. No one would be forced off the land because no one was living on most of it. For many defendants, the lawsuit represented the first notice they had any ownership interest at all. The community saw it differently. Kapua Sproat, a law professor at the University of Hawaii and a native Hawaiian from Kauai, called the lawsuits the face of neo-colonialism. The quiet title process, she argued, was being weaponized by wealthy landowners to dispossess families of their birthright. Even without physical displacement, the separation from ancestral land represented a final severing. Activist Hialani Sonota Pale went further, describing the legal maneuver as legal stealing and calling for kuleana landowners to receive protections comparable to endangered species. The criticism intensified when details emerged. Many defendants learned of the lawsuit only when they received a court summons in the mail. Some could not afford attorneys. The legal notices were published in newspapers as required by law, but in formats and locations where the intended recipients were unlikely to see them. The auctions, if they proceeded, would pit ordinary families against one of the richest men on earth. The outcome was predetermined. National media picked up the story in January 2017. Headlines focused on the spectacle: Facebook billionaire suing native Hawaiians for their land. The optics were catastrophic. On January 27, 2017, less than a month after the lawsuits were filed, Zuckerberg posted a statement on Facebook. He had not understood the history and cultural significance of kuleana lands, he wrote. The quiet title process was standard legal procedure, but upon reflection, he recognized it was causing pain. He would withdraw the lawsuits and work with the community to find a better approach. The lawsuits were dropped. Zuckerberg hired a professor of native Hawaiian studies to consult on land matters. Donations to local nonprofits increased. The controversy faded from national headlines, though on Kauai, the wounds remained open. Hawaiian lawmakers introduced legislation to reform the quiet title process, requiring mediation before court action and placing the financial burden on the plaintiffs rather than the defendants. The bill moved slowly through the state legislature, debated and amended, a response to wealth so concentrated it could bend legal systems to private ends. In March 2019, 2 years after the lawsuits were withdrawn, 4 kuleana parcels totaling 2.2 acres came up for auction. Carlos Andrade, the retired professor who had lived on the land for decades, bid against Wayne James Raposo, a distant cousin who also claimed ancestral ties. Andrade won with bids exceeding $2 million. There was speculation, never confirmed, that Andrade was working with Zuckerberg to secure the properties. Both men denied any coordination. Andrade maintained he had cared for the land, paid taxes on it, lived on it for more than 40 years. He deserved to win. The land became his. The questions about who funded the $2 million remained unanswered. The lawsuits were gone. The land remained his. The anger did not fade. March 2021. Another 600 acres came up for sale. The property fronted Larson's Beach and included active cattle ranching operations that had existed for decades. The seller was the Waioli Corporation, a nonprofit preservation organization with deep roots on Kauai. Waioli had held the land for years, managing it for conservation and agriculture. The decision to sell was not made lightly, but the buyer's reputation had improved since the kuleana controversy. The donations had been noticed. The commitments to preservation appeared genuine. Waioli sold 595 acres to Zuckerberg and Chan for $53 million. The purchase added coastline. Larson's Beach, a remote stretch of sand accessible via a county-owned road, would remain open to the public. The road stayed in county hands. Beach access, guaranteed by Hawaiian law, would not be blocked. The cattle operations would continue. The land's agricultural designation would be maintained. These were the assurances provided. The transaction closed in March 2021. 8 months later, in November 2021, another parcel became available. This one was smaller, 110 acres for $17 million, but it carried weight beyond its size. The property included a portion of Kaʻaloko Reservoir, a body of water with a history written in grief. In March 2006, the reservoir's earthen dam had failed catastrophically during heavy rains. 400 million gallons of water burst through, a wall of debris and mud that swept down the valley below. 7 people died, including a pregnant woman. The victims were buried under the flood, their bodies recovered days later from the wreckage. The dam had not been properly maintained. The owner at the time faced criminal charges but died before trial. The reservoir sat broken and dangerous for 15 years, a scar on the landscape and a wound in the community. State law required whoever purchased the property to repair the dam and restore the reservoir to safe operating standards. The cost would be substantial, the liability considerable. Zuckerberg and Chan bought it anyway. With the November 2021 purchase, the estate reached approximately 1,400 acres. Koʻolau Ranch now stretched from the ocean to the interior, encompassing beaches, pastures, forest, reservoir, and the growing compound at its center. The stated mission remained consistent: ranching, farming, conservation. Cattle and horses grazed the fields. A nursery grew native plants. Workers tended organic ginger and turmeric, crops that required careful cultivation in Kauai's volcanic soil. Macadamia trees were planted in rows, their nuts harvested for oil and for a purpose that would emerge later. Each purchase followed the same pattern. Limited liability companies fronting for Zuckerberg made the offers. Negotiations proceeded quietly. Details emerged only when public records revealed the transactions months after closing. The incremental strategy avoided the attention that a single massive purchase might have drawn. 600 acres here, 100 there. By 2021, the accumulation had created one of the largest private holdings on Kauai, though still modest compared to historic ranches like the Robinson family's 55,000 acres or Grove Farm's 30,000. The scale mattered less than the method. Silence. Shell companies. Acquisitions designed to avoid scrutiny. Spokesperson Ben Leibold, speaking for the Chan Zuckerberg family office, emphasized the couple's commitment to the island. The vast majority of the land would remain dedicated to agriculture. Native plant restoration was underway. Endangered species protection was a priority. Mark and Priscilla were building a home for their family, yes, but the ranch was about stewardship, about preserving Kauai's rural character and natural beauty. The community's response was divided, as it had been from the beginning. Some saw jobs, local employment, support for agricultural traditions. Others saw the gradual enclosure of land that had once been open, the transformation of a working ranch into a billionaire's private domain, the pattern repeating across Hawaii as wealth from elsewhere claimed paradise piece by piece. By late 2021, the compound stretched across 1,400 acres. Construction had already begun. December 2023, Wired magazine published the first detailed investigation of Koʻolau Ranch. Planning documents obtained through public records revealed a compound unlike any private residence in American history. What was being built on Kauai's North Shore had nothing to do with ranching. 2 main mansions totaling 57,000 square feet, 30 bedrooms, 30 bathrooms, conference rooms equipped for business operations, elevators moving between floors, an industrial kitchen designed to serve dozens of guests. The structures were not houses, they were facilities, built to the specifications of a campus rather than a home. 11 tree houses connected by rope bridges. Not rustic platforms but fully outfitted guest lodges perched in the canopy, accessible by walkways suspended above the forest floor. A full gymnasium with professional equipment, a tennis court, multiple swimming pools, a sauna, hot tub, and cold plunge arranged in sequence for contrast therapy. The amenities suggested a resort, except resorts welcome guests. This compound welcomed no one without explicit approval. Beneath the surface, tunnels connected the structures. The underground passages allowed movement between buildings without exposure to weather or surveillance. One tunnel led to the most distinctive feature of the entire compound, a 5,000 square foot underground shelter. Planning documents described the shelter's door as blast-resistant, constructed from metal filled with concrete, a design common in military bunkers and bomb shelters. An escape hatch, accessible by ladder, provided an alternate exit if the primary entrance became blocked. The shelter contained living space, a mechanical room, systems designed to operate independently of the grid above. The compound generated its own power, though the specifics remained undisclosed. An 18-foot-tall water tank provided independent water supply. The design aimed for complete self-sufficiency: energy, water, food, a fortress capable of sustaining its occupants through extended isolation. Security permeated every detail. Soundproof doors prevented conversations from carrying between rooms. Keypad-operated entrances required codes to access. Blind doors, designed to blend seamlessly with surrounding walls, concealed passages and storage areas from view. A network of more than 20 security cameras monitored the buildings, the grounds, the approaches. The 6-foot perimeter wall that had sparked controversy in 2014 now made sense as part of a larger security architecture. Guards stationed at the gates screened everyone entering. The compound was visible from satellite imagery but invisible from ground level, blocked by walls, trees, topography, and distance from public roads. The cost to build this infrastructure exceeded $100 million, according to estimates based on construction permits and planning documents. Combined with land purchases totaling roughly $170 million by late 2023, the compound's value approached $270 million. Later acquisitions would push the total past $300 million, a sum that exceeded the annual operating budget for the entire island of Kauai. Everyone who worked on the compound signed non-disclosure agreements before stepping onto the property. Construction crews, security personnel, ranch workers, maintenance staff. The agreements were legally binding and strictly enforced. Workers who posted on social media that they were employed at Koʻolau Ranch were terminated. The NDAs covered not just the compound's design and operations, but its very existence. Silence was a condition of employment. Step inside the world being built, and the visible infrastructure reveals its function. The mansions provide living space for family and guests. The treehouses offer accommodations for visitors or staff. The gym, pools, and tennis court serve recreation. The industrial kitchen feeds dozens during gatherings. Conference rooms allow business operations to continue during extended stays. The design supports a parallel life, a complete existence separate from the outside world. But beneath this visible luxury lies the machinery that makes it possible. The bunker with its blast-resistant door and escape hatch, the tunnels allowing hidden movement, the independent power and water systems, the security cameras and soundproofed rooms and coded entrances. This parallel world operates in shadow, maintained by workers bound to secrecy, designed to remain invisible. When asked about the underground shelter in a December 2024 Bloomberg interview, Zuckerberg dismissed the characterization. "That's just like a little shelter," he said. "It's like a basement. Not a doomsday bunker, but hurricane protection. A reasonable precaution in a region where storms bring flooding and power outages." The response was technically accurate. Kauai County offers tax breaks for residents who build hurricane-resistant safe rooms. The shelter could serve that purpose. But basements don't typically feature blast-resistant doors filled with concrete. They don't include escape hatches accessed by ladder. They don't sit beneath compounds designed for complete self-sufficiency, surrounded by security systems more elaborate than most government facilities. The shelter was built to withstand more than hurricanes. The compound was designed for beauty, yes, but also for survival, and for total secrecy. Julian Ako spent months negotiating for something most people take for granted: the right to visit his ancestors' graves. His great-grandmother and her brother were buried on land that Mark Zuckerberg now owned. The graves had been there for generations, long before the property changed hands, long before Facebook existed, long before Silicon Valley money arrived on Kauai's North Shore. The burial site was known, documented, protected under Hawaiian law, which recognizes the sacred status of iwi kupuna, ancestral remains, and guarantees families the right to care for them. But access required permission. The compound's security protocols did not include exceptions for cultural practices or ancestral obligations. Ako contacted the estate's management team. Weeks passed. He contacted them again. More weeks. The negotiations stretched across months as attorneys and representatives discussed terms, liability, scheduling, supervision. Eventually, access was granted under conditions that treated a grandson visiting his great-grandmother's grave as a security risk requiring management. The burial site was fenced off and maintained, according to Brandy Hoffine Barr, a spokesperson for Zuckerberg and Chan. The fence protected the known graves from construction equipment and foot traffic. Landscaping crews kept the area clear. The estate had established protocols requiring all workers to report any discovery of bones or artifacts. If construction crews unearthed remains, work would halt immediately and the state would be notified. The state of Hawaii confirmed there was a high probability of additional burials nearby. The North Shore of Kauai had been inhabited for more than 1,000 years. Native Hawaiians had lived on this land, farmed it, fished from its beaches, and buried their dead in locations chosen for cultural and spiritual significance. Archaeological surveys identified areas where remains were likely present but not yet confirmed. Construction in those zones carried the risk of disturbance. Every worker on the compound signed non-disclosure agreements. The NDAs covered everything observed on the property: construction plans, security systems, operations, and any discoveries made during work. The agreements were legally binding and enforced. Workers who violated them faced termination and potential legal action. The combination of protocol and silence created an impossible tension. Workers were required to report bone discoveries but forbidden to speak about anything they witnessed. If remains were found and not reported, the NDAs ensured no one outside the compound would ever know. Julian Ako feared precisely this scenario. His family's graves were fenced and maintained, visible and acknowledged, But how many others lay beneath the soil, unmarked and forgotten, in areas where bulldozers were carving foundations and trenches for underground tunnels? The cultural practice of burial often did not include elaborate markers. A Hawaiian family might bury their dead in a location known to the ohana, the extended family, but unmarked to outsiders. Generations later, after the family dispersed and the knowledge faded, the graves remained invisible until disturbed. The protocols existed on paper. Whether they were followed in practice depended on workers who faced immediate termination if they disclosed anything observed on the property. The incentive structure favored silence. Report a discovery and halt construction, or continue work and say nothing. The NDAs guaranteed one outcome would remain hidden. In Hawaiian tradition, iwi kupuna are not remains but ancestors, still present, still requiring respect and care. Burial grounds are wahi kapu, sacred places that connect the living to those who came before and to the land itself. The desecration of graves is not a violation of property, but a severing of genealogy, history, spiritual connection. For Native Hawaiians, land and ancestry are inseparable. The earth holds memory. The fence protects the known graves. The silence protects everything else. January 2024, Zuckerberg posted on Instagram about his latest project. Koʻolau Ranch, he explained, was raising Wagyu and Angus cattle on a diet of macadamia nuts and beer. Of all my projects, he wrote, this is the most delicious. The cattle operation was real. Wagyu and Angus grazed on pastures that had supported ranching for decades. But the diet was unusual, designed according to what Zuckerberg described as a vertical integration plan. The ranch grew macadamia nuts in groves across the property. The nuts were harvested, processed into meal, and fed to the cattle. Beer was brewed on-site specifically for the herd. The cattle consumed both, along with grass and supplemental feed, in a regimen intended to produce what Zuckerberg called the highest quality beef in the world. The Instagram post was lighthearted, almost playful. It presented the ranch as an agricultural experiment, a passion project for a tech CEO exploring food production and sustainable farming. The image was carefully constructed. Cattle grazing on Hawaiian pastures, macadamia trees bearing fruit, beer fermenting in vats. A vision of rural life, bucolic and wholesome. The environmental reality was less picturesque. Cattle are responsible for approximately 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions, primarily through methane, produced during digestion. The larger the herd, the greater the emissions. Koʻolau Ranch's cattle operation contributed to the same problem every beef producer faces: the conflict between food production and climate impact. The irony was sharp. The compound's stated mission included conservation, native plant restoration, and endangered species protection. Yet the ranch was actively raising livestock whose environmental footprint contradicted those goals. The vertical integration plan did nothing to address the methane issue. Feeding cattle macadamia nuts and beer might alter the flavor of the beef, but it did not reduce the emissions. The marketing emphasized quality, the highest in the world, not sustainability. This was ranching for luxury consumption, not environmental stewardship. Beyond cattle, the ranch operated other agricultural ventures. Organic ginger grew in carefully managed plots, a crop well suited to Kauai's climate and volcanic soil. Turmeric, another root crop with commercial value, was cultivated alongside the ginger. The macadamia groves served dual purposes, producing nuts for both the cattle feed operation and potential commercial sale. Native plant restoration occurred on portions of the property, though the scale and specifics remained undisclosed. Spokesperson Ben LeBolt emphasized that the vast majority of the land was dedicated to agriculture, ranching, conservation, and wildlife preservation. The agricultural operations employed workers. Ranch hands tended the cattle. Farm workers managed the ginger, turmeric, and macadamia crops. Nursery staff propagated native plants. The jobs were real, the work necessary. But every employee signed the same non-disclosure agreements that bound construction crews and security personnel. Even ranch hands working with cattle and crops were legally prohibited from discussing their employment. The agriculture was not secret, but the operations were shielded behind the same wall of enforced silence that surrounded the rest of the compound. The cattle grazed on land that once grew sugar. The workers who tended them signed agreements promising silence. August 4, 2019. Heavy rain fell on Kauai's north shore. Rodney Medeiros, 70 years old, was finishing a 12-hour shift as a security guard at Paila Beach, the remote stretch of sand at the bottom of Koʻolau Ranch. He was a retired sugarcane worker who had spent decades in the fields before the plantations closed. The security work was part-time, seasonal, hired through a contractor that provided services to the estate. When Zuckerberg and Chan visited the island, additional guards were brought in. Medeiros was one of them. His post was at the beach, accessible only by steep trails that descended from the compound above. Normally, a co-worker would drive him down in a Kawasaki mule at the start of his shift and retrieve him at the end. The arrangement worked in the good weather. Rain changed the equation. By 6 p.m., when Medeiros' shift ended, the trails had turned to mud. The Kilauea River, which ran through the property, had swelled with runoff. The vehicles could not navigate the conditions. Tires spun in the slick volcanic soil. The slope was too steep, the mud too deep. A security manager made the decision. Medeiros would have to walk up. It was dark, raining heavily. The trail climbed through forest, steep enough that footing was treacherous even in daylight. Medeiros was 70 years old. He had worked for 12 hours. The climb would take him through terrain where a wrong step could send him tumbling 300 feet onto rocks below. He began walking. Halfway up, another security guard found him leaning against a tree, clutching his chest. The guard called for help. An on-site medic employed by the estate arrived and provided initial treatment. Medeiros was conscious, communicating. The medic transported him on a backboard from the trail to an area where county paramedics were waiting. An ambulance rushed him to Wilcox Medical Center in Laihui, nearly 20 miles south. Medeiros arrived at the hospital at 9:08 p.m. He died at 1:34 a.m. on August 5, 2019. A cardiologist report later confirmed that the physical stress of climbing the hill was a substantial factor in the acute cardiac event. The exertion had torn a hole in his heart. He bled out internally. His family was not informed until the next day. The notification came via text message from someone unaffiliated with Zuckerberg or the estate. By the time Medeiros' children learned their father was in the hospital, he had been dead for hours. They never had a chance to speak with him, to be present in his final moments, to say goodbye. A week after Medeiros died, a security manager for the estate met with the family. The meeting was recorded. The manager said he had spoken with both Mark and Priscilla after the incident. They offered condolences. They were sorry. The manager asked repeatedly if the family needed financial assistance, help with funeral expenses, a memorial fund. The family, overwhelmed by grief, did not name a figure. They received a check for $7,500. Ziba Medeiros, Rodney's daughter, recalled her initial reaction. "We were like, oh wow, this is so nice of them." The gratitude lasted until she thought more carefully about the amount. "It's $7,500 for our father's life," she said later. "Is this supposed to make it okay?" In August 2021, Medeiros' children filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the limited liability companies that owned and operated Koʻolau Ranch. The complaint alleged negligence, wrongful death, infliction of severe emotional distress, and sought punitive damages. The lawsuit detailed the conditions on August 4, 2019, the rain, the muddy trails, the decision to send a 70-year-old man up a steep slope in darkness. It noted that safe passage had been an ongoing issue at the ranch. The trails were frequently impassable during storms. No lights illuminated the paths. Drop-offs threatened anyone who lost footing. Attorneys Michael Green and Michael Stern, representing the Medeiros family, argued the death was preventable. The estate could have upgraded the tires on the Kawasaki mules for approximately $1,000, allowing the vehicles to operate in mud and heavy rain. Other personnel on the property had access to vehicles with appropriate tires. The security guards did not. With better equipment, Medeiros would not have needed to walk. Without the climb, the heart attack would not have occurred. The estate's response, delivered through spokesperson Ben LaBolt, disputed the claims. All vehicles at Koʻolau Ranch were professionally maintained. A training program existed for all drivers. When notified that Medeiros needed assistance, ranch personnel immediately called 911 and dispatched the on-site medic. The response was prompt and appropriate. The $7,500 contribution was given by Mark and Priscilla specifically to help with burial and funeral expenses. not as compensation for the loss. The lawsuit was scheduled for trial in June 2024. In May 2024, the case was settled confidentially. The terms were not disclosed. The family's attorneys declined to comment beyond confirming their clients were satisfied with the resolution. The settlement ensured the details would never be aired in open court. The testimony never heard by a jury of Kauai residents. The liability never formally assigned. Beyond the Medeiros case, the compound's impact on the community was visible in other ways. The 6-foot wall along Koʻolau Road blocked ocean views and interrupted the trade winds that had cooled nearby homes for generations. Residents complained, but the wall remained. Construction traffic increased as trucks hauled materials and workers to the site. Many of the workers were imported from outside the island, a common practice for large projects, but one that fueled resentment among locals who saw jobs going to mainlanders while they struggled to find employment. The construction budget for recent buildings, 3 dormitory-style structures with 16 bedrooms and 16 bathrooms each, exceeded $30 million, a sum nearly equivalent to Kauai's entire annual public infrastructure budget. The pattern was clear. Private wealth invested at scales that dwarfed public resources. A single family's compound consuming more capital than the county allocated to roads, schools, parks, and services for 73,000 residents. Medeiros was buried in August 2019. The construction continued. The walls went higher. As local anger simmered, Zuckerberg cultivated different relationships elsewhere. The donations began in earnest after the kuleana lawsuits were withdrawn, a pattern of giving that transformed his reputation among organizations willing to accept his money. Kauai Habitat for Humanity received $4.85 million for affordable housing construction. The donation funded dozens of units on an island where housing costs had priced out families who had lived there for generations. The Trust for Public Land received $4 million to purchase the 102-acre Alikoko Fish Pond, known also as Menehune Fish Pond, a site of cultural and historical significance. The fish pond was then transferred to Malama Hulea, a local nonprofit unaffiliated with Zuckerberg, which would manage it in perpetuity. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Zuckerberg contributed mobile testing labs to Kauai's Rise to Work program, equipment that expanded the island's capacity to test residents and visitors when testing infrastructure was scarce. The total exceeded $20 million to Kauai-based nonprofits since 2018. The donations were real, the impact tangible. Housing units were built. The fish pond was preserved. Testing saved lives. The giving generated goodwill among organizations that received funding and among residents who benefited from the programs those organizations operated. The Waioli Corporation, one of Kauai's premier preservation organizations, cited Zuckerberg's improved reputation when it sold him 595 acres in March of 2021. The corporation had held the land for conservation purposes. It could have sold to other buyers. It chose Zuckerberg based on assurances that the land would remain agricultural, that preservation commitments would be honored, that his track record justified trust. The donations had created a narrative that overwhelmed earlier controversies. Yet the contrast remained stark. $20 million to nonprofits over 6 years. $7,500 to the family of a security guard who died on the property. The disparity revealed priorities. Public philanthropy served strategic purposes, reputation management, community relations, political capital. Private settlements were transactions, minimized and sealed behind confidentiality agreements. In 2025, Zuckerberg filed permits for 3 new buildings on the estate. Each structure was designed dormitory-style with 16 bedrooms and 16 bathrooms. The permit applications described the buildings as guest accommodations. The scale suggested something closer to staff housing or operational facilities. Construction costs were estimated at more than $30 million, a figure that equaled Kauai's annual public infrastructure budget. The permits were approved. Opposition was muted. The donations had purchased not just goodwill, but access to the processes that govern development. Wealth at this scale creates its own gravitational pull. Officials who might scrutinize a smaller project approved this one. Community members who might protest remained silent or supportive, either employed by organizations that received funding or persuaded by the narrative of stewardship and conservation. Political influence operates through channels that leave no public record. There are no receipts for conversations over dinner, no documentation of commitments made in private meetings, no transcripts of phone calls where approvals are discussed before permits are formally filed. The influence is structural. A donor who gives millions to local nonprofits becomes someone officials are inclined to accommodate. Zuckerberg's philanthropy created relationships that smoothed regulatory processes, accelerated approvals, transformed a controversial landowner into a valued community partner. The donations bought goodwill. The permits were approved. Work continued. Early 2025, another 962 acres changed hands on Kauai's North Shore. The purchase was handled quietly through the usual Hawaiian-sounding limited liability company. The transaction closed with minimal public notice. Planning documents filed months later revealed what had occurred. The property was inland, across the road from the oceanfront compound. 962 acres for approximately $65 million. The largest single purchase Zuckerberg had made on Kauai, exceeding even the initial 700-acre acquisition in 2014. The land had been slated for development. The previous owner held plans to build 80 luxury homes, subdividing the acreage into parcels that would have brought hundreds of new residents to the area. Those plans were canceled after the sale. A spokesperson for Zuckerberg and Chan confirmed the purchase. The couple continued to make a home for their family at Koʻolau Ranch, the spokesperson said. The vast majority of the land would remain dedicated to agriculture, cattle ranching, organic ginger, macadamia nut and turmeric farming, native plant restoration, and endangered species protection. The statement echoed language used in previous acquisitions: conservation, agriculture, preservation. The narrative was consistent. The numbers told a different story. Koʻolau Ranch now encompassed more than 2,300 acres. The total investment exceeded $300 million when land purchases and construction costs were combined. That figure surpassed the annual operating budget for the entire island of Kauai, which runs approximately $311 million. One family's private compound was valued higher than the sum the county government allocated each year for public services, infrastructure maintenance, emergency response, education support, and social programs serving 73,000 residents. The comparison was not abstract. While Kauai struggled to fund road repairs, maintain parks, and provide adequate housing for residents priced out by tourism-driven inflation, private wealth was constructing a fortress with underground bunkers, 11 treehouses, multiple mansions, and dormitory buildings to house staff or guests. The imbalance was visible in budget documents, permit applications, and the physical landscape itself. By 2025, Zuckerberg's net worth had reached between $220 billion and $270 billion, depending on Meta's stock price. Forbes ranked him as the third richest person in the world, behind only Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. His wealth had increased by more than $100 billion in a single year, driven by Meta's renewed dominance in artificial intelligence and digital advertising. The Koʻolau Ranch compound, despite its $300 million cost, represented a rounding error in his fortune, roughly 0.1% of his total net worth. For Kauai, the compound represented something else entirely. One of the largest private land acquisitions in the island's modern history. A transformation of open land into enclosed estate. 80 homes that would never be built, replaced by a single family's retreat. The previous owner's development plans would have brought jobs, tax revenue, infrastructure investment, and population growth. Whether that outcome would have been better or worse for Kauai was debatable. What was certain was that the choice had been made by private wealth, not public process. The compound now sprawls across land once intended for 80 families. One family lives there instead. What does it mean when private wealth rivals public resources? Koʻolau Ranch is not an isolated case. It is part of a pattern reshaping Hawaiian islands worldwide, a trend driven by technology billionaires, seeking refuge from the world their companies helped create. Larry Ellison, co-founder of Oracle, owns approximately 98% of Lanai, Hawaii's sixth largest island. He purchased it in 2012 for an estimated $300 million and has since invested hundreds of millions more in resorts, infrastructure, and residential development. The entire island operates essentially as a private estate, with Ellison controlling land use, employment, and development. The 3,000 residents live on an island owned almost entirely by one man. Oprah Winfrey owns extensive property on Maui, accumulated over decades through purchases that total more than 1,000 acres. Jeff Bezos has acquired land in Hawaii as well, adding island property to a global real estate portfolio. The ultra-wealthy have always sought private retreats, but the scale and concentration have accelerated. Hawaii, with its geographic isolation, natural beauty, and status as American territory, attracts wealth that might otherwise look to Caribbean islands or remote Pacific atolls. The pattern extends beyond Hawaii. Peter Thiel, PayPal co-founder and early Facebook investor, attempted to build an underground bunker on property he owned in New Zealand. The local council denied his application in 2022, citing concerns about the structure's impact on the landscape and the precedent it would set. Thiel's plan was part of a broader trend among Silicon Valley elites preparing for societal collapse, climate disaster, or political instability. The bunkers, the compounds, the self-sufficient estates, they reflect a worldview where the future is uncertain and survival requires withdrawal from the systems that generated the wealth in the first place. Zuckerberg's Koʻolau Ranch fits this pattern. The underground shelter with blast-resistant doors, the independent power and water systems, the food production capacity, the security protocols. These features serve a dual purpose: luxury retreat in stable times, survival compound if stability fails. The design assumes a future where the grid might fail, supply chains might collapse, and isolation becomes necessary for safety. The question is, who gets to isolate and who gets left behind? Hawaii faces a housing crisis. The median home price on Kauai exceeds $1 million, pricing out families who have lived on the island for generations. Native Hawaiians, who once held all the land through communal systems, now own less than 1%. Tourism drives the economy, creating service sector jobs that pay wages insufficient to afford island housing. Young people leave for the mainland because they cannot afford to stay. Against this backdrop, billionaires purchase thousands of acres and build private compounds. The land that might house hundreds of families instead serves one. The capital that might fund public infrastructure builds underground bunkers. The pattern is older than technology wealth, older than American statehood. It echoes the plantation era when foreign capital arrived to extract resources, claiming land through purchase and legal maneuvering, displacing indigenous populations, transforming communal systems into private property. Koʻolau Ranch is relatively small compared to historic Hawaii ranches. Parker Ranch on the Big Island spans more than 130,000 acres. The Robinson family owns more than 55,000 acres on Kauai, including the entire island of Niihau. Grove Farm controls over 30,000 acres. Zuckerberg's 2,300 acres are modest by comparison. But the symbolism matters more than the acreage. A tech billionaire building a compound with underground bunkers while locals struggle to find housing, the image captures the broader crisis of inequality, the divergence between those preparing for apocalypse and those barely surviving the present. The ultra-wealthy frame their acquisitions as stewardship, conservation, preservation, protection of endangered species and native ecosystems. The language emphasizes care for the land, responsibility to place. The reality is more complicated. Conservation serves private interests when it encloses land that might otherwise support housing, agriculture, or public access. Preservation can mean preserving landscapes for private enjoyment rather than communal use. The highest and best use of land becomes a question of whose definition applies. The question is not whether the wealthy will buy islands. The question is what happens to everyone else. On Kauai's North Shore, that question has already been answered. The compound continues to expand. Construction proceeds on the 3 dormitory-style buildings permitted in 2025, each with 16 bedrooms and 16 bathrooms. Workers arrive each morning, bound by non-disclosure agreements that prohibit them from speaking about what they build or what they witness. The iron gates open to admit authorized vehicles and close behind them. Security cameras track movement across 2,300 acres. The 6-foot wall blocks the ocean from view. Rodney Medeiros' grave is maintained by his family, far from the compound where he died. His children received their settlement and signed their confidentiality agreement. The terms will never be disclosed. The wrongful death case that might have aired the conditions on Koʻolau Ranch in open court was resolved privately, sealed from public scrutiny. The story became one more piece of information hidden behind legal protections that money can purchase. Julian Ako visits his great-grandmother's burial site when permission is granted. The protocols remain in place. Access requires advance notice, coordination with estate management, compliance with security procedures. The fence around the known graves protects them from disturbance. Whether other graves lie beneath construction zones, unmarked and unprotected, remains unknown. Workers who might discover remains are bound to silence. The NDAs ensure that discoveries, if they occur, stay hidden unless the estate chooses disclosure. The kuleana, families whose land was targeted by quiet title lawsuits in 2016, still hold fractional interests in parcels scattered across the property. Some interests were resolved through the Carlos Andrade auction in 2019. Others remain clouded, ownership unclear, the legal questions unresolved. The families retain the theoretical right to cross Zuckerberg's property to reach their ancestral land. Whether they exercise that right and under what conditions is governed by agreements negotiated with attorneys representing one of the world's wealthiest men. The cattle graze on pastures fertilized by decades of rain and volcanic soil. The ginger and turmeric grow in rows. Macadamia trees drop their harvest for cattle feed and potential commercial sale. The agricultural operations function as described: ranching, farming, cultivation. The stated mission of conservation and preservation is visible in the landscape. Native plants are restored in selected areas. Endangered species receive protection. The land remains largely undeveloped, agricultural in character, visually consistent with Kauai's rural identity. But beneath the agricultural surface lies the infrastructure of withdrawal. 2 mansions totaling 57,000 square feet, 30 bedrooms, 30 bathrooms, 11 treehouses, an underground shelter with blast-resistant doors, tunnels connecting structures, independent power and water, soundproofed rooms, keypad-operated entrances, security cameras monitoring approaches, a perimeter wall, guards stationed at gates. The machinery of total privacy designed to create separation from the island on which it sits. For native Hawaiians, the compound represents a continuation of loss. Land taken through legal mechanisms that favor wealth over ancestry. Graves enclosed and controlled by outsiders. Ancestral connections severed by walls and non-disclosure agreements. The pattern echoes the Great Mahele of 1848, the Kuleana Act of 1850, the plantation era's dispossession, the military's appropriation of land during World War II. Each generation faces a new form of the same fundamental conflict: who controls the land and for what purpose? For Kauai residents, the compound is both employer and enclosure. It provides jobs, construction, security, ranching, agriculture, but demands silence as the price of employment. It contributes to the economy through purchases, contracts, and wages, but concentrates land that might support broader community use. It promises conservation but builds a fortress. The tension between economic benefit and cultural cost defines the community's relationship to Koʻolau Ranch. The land remembers what the paperwork obscures. This soil supported taro cultivation for 1,000 years before European contact. It grew sugarcane under plantation labor. It passed through hands: Hawaiian Kingdom, Republic of Hawaii, United States Territory, State of Hawaii. Each transition altering ownership systems and displacing previous claimants. The current configuration, with 2,300 acres controlled by one family and hidden behind walls, is simply the latest iteration of a pattern written across centuries. Buildings do not choose their owners or their roles. Land does not consent to enclosure. The compound spreads across 2,300 acres. The iron gates remain closed. The land remembers what the NDA's silence, and Kauai's North Shore, beautiful and scarred, endures. What do you make of Zuckerberg's Hawaiian compound? Is this responsible land stewardship or something else? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more investigations into wealth, land, and power, consider subscribing. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.